but I want to just kind of outline some goals. So what I'm aiming to do with this research is to bring the infancy narratives into dialogue with the realities of adult survivors of childhood sexual trauma. So the realities that adult survivors of childhood sexual trauma face and the infancy narratives, I want to kind of mash those two things together and see what can embodied theology teach us at the intersection of those. So in doing that, I would aim to revisit Scripture, so traditional stories that we have heard 1,000 times over, and say, how can we look at this in a different way to provide new insight? And that will give survivors a popular model in Christendom that they can relate to. And to, in the process of that, encourage the formation of resilience with critical scriptural interpretation. So it's kind of an outline of what we'll be doing in the next 50 minutes or so. Okay? So I do want to begin with a trigger warning. So we will be talking about sexual trauma, particularly childhood sexual trauma, and that can sometimes be difficult for people. So if there's ever a moment that you need to feel like you need to excuse yourself, that's completely fine. I want to begin with a story. Marie closed her eyes tightly and felt her entire body tense. Not again, she thought, as the hands of a much older man crawled over her 15-year-old body. She tried to step away, but his grip tightened. She felt paralyzed in the silence, and she could feel his fingertips pressing into the back of her upper arm, while the other hand encompassed her entire breast. The ritual was always the same. He somehow always managed to find a moment alone with her, even though she made deliberate efforts to never be alone in his presence. The molestation always occurred in absolute silence. She imagined that he thought this was normal, while she pretended that it wasn't happening. And these moments were horrifyingly endless. Marie held her breath. She was frozen and immobile, acutely aware of the tension in her back and stomach as her mind was exiled from her body. Later at home, she expertly hid the abuse. Severe migraines and spontaneous bouts of hysterical crying were chalked up to teenage hormones. She didn't understand what was happening to her, and for years she thought that these bodily responses were normal. No one in the home noticed her distress as her father ruled with his violent and jealous outbursts. Marie found herself fleeing for multiple years as she sought safety in unknown lands. For years, Marie hid, even from herself, the various forms of abuse that she endured. And over time, she would realize that her wounds would be her teacher in her journey towards resilience. She must re-enter the experiences in order to fully feel and integrate the harm that she had endured. This journey would be fraught with heavy shame and confusion as she learned to trust both herself and others again. And over time, she would grow to see herself as both wounded and resilient, childhood victim and adult survivor, aware and yet in a continual process of discovery. Understanding one's story in the process of resilience, however, is not a simple feat. Resilience can be defined as the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threat, or significant sources of stress. It requires listening to the truths of the body in order to integrate the deepest traumas of one's life. Utilizing an embodied theological approach can facilitate this awareness and act as a guide along the painful journey. Embodied theology is best understood as theology through the body rather than theology about the body. The body, in all its experiences, holds profound knowledge of God, self, and the world. And a living model for exploring embodied theology is the Blessed Mother Mary. While the church has espoused the truth that humanity is made in God's image, Mary goes one step further in that she literally carries the divine within her. As the mother of humanity, and indeed of embodied theology, the pregnant mother can provide significant theological insight for any of those seeking to understand their own theological body language more deeply. Some experiences are so blindingly painful, however, that listening to the body is difficult. and it may require approaching one's story indirectly at first. For survivors, particularly those of child sexual abuse, the details of their stories are often not consciously known. The body remembers, but often the mind dissociates and suppresses the details of the horrifying experiences in an effort to protect itself. Vivid feelings may remain, which are connected to snapshot memories, and the brain is often incapable of ascribing language to the event. In instances such as these, the connective power of Mary's pregnancy narrative is made known as God's presence is discovered within the unexpected body. So this research explores the traditional infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, but also calls forth the Infancy Gospel of James to evaluate the embodied resilience of Mary. So the first thing that we'll be doing is discussing kind of an embodied Marian theology, and we'll unpack that a little bit. The next thing is we will look at the prevalence and impact of childhood sexual trauma, and we'll establish resilience as the primary language rather than healing, because healing implies you'll be a one-off cure, whereas resilience implies wholeness and integration. Then we will look at the canonical infancy narratives that are in Matthew and Luke, and the Infancy Gospel of James. So we'll give some special consideration to a few key elements in those narratives, mostly Mary's experience of community in Luke, displacement in Matthew, and shame and confusion in the Infancy Gospel of James will be highlighted. So bringing these three into dialogue, it will be concluded that Mary operates as a vehicle for reflection on resilience and helps facilitate an embodied theological understanding of resilience for adult survivors of child sexual abuse. So you can see that we've got a couple powerful slides that are going to be coming up, one right behind me. Mary's decision to accept the role as mother of the Messiah has led history to uphold her as a dynamic symbol of faith, courage, and purity. So she's been paralleled with Eve, her obedience countering Eve's disobedience. She's been paralleled with Rachel and interpreted as the patron of all mothers. Popularly, she's been presented as kind of a perpetual virgin, at once both pious and adventurous, both mysteriously powerful and decidedly human. This rich tradition of Marian theology communicates this deep reflection that was going on in the early Christian tradition about her life and its implications for humanity. But to bring Mary into dialogue with adult survivors of child sexual abuse to facilitate resilience may seem a bit dichotomous or at odds. After all, what could they have in common? In addition to Mary's virginity, she also faced profound struggle, fear, and shame as she navigated pregnancy, birth, and survival. To reflect on her experience is to join early Christians in their quest for understanding and connection to the fully embodied Mother of Christ. So I want to take a moment to just let these images soak in as we kind of sit in the awareness of the opposition, the seeming opposition between what Mary has experienced and what childhood survivors experience. If the church can't look at the person who is upheld as the model of femininity and motherhood and consider her struggle, her bodily change, and her pain, then significant theological insights are missed. So while some traditions uphold her as a perpetual virgin who experienced no pain during childbirth, others represent her as a fully embodied woman whose body hurt, bled, and stretched as she pushed Christ into the world. Whichever understanding one adheres to, it cannot be denied that Mary was and still remains a symbol of faith and purity for all of Christendom. So when considering both a fully human Mary and a sexually abused child, the inclination is to look away. We don't want to offend our sensitivities. Mary is, after all, this reverent symbol and foundation for Christendom, and we dare not interpret her too broadly. Right? We don't want to get too out there with what we do with Mary. And on the opposite end, the abuse of children is horrifying. And yet it's so horrifying that the tendency is to just not look at it for too long because it's too painful. Noticing this discomfort that resides in this deeper analysis is a call to lean in. After all, if we can't fathom Mary with a pregnant belly whose back aches from the weight of her child, then how can we even hope to consider the suffering of an innocent child that's been abused? By leaning in, it's possible to discover the wisdom that is held in the bodies of Mary and adult survivors of child sexual abuse. Mary and her body are the symbols of purity, but also symbols of resilience. Next slide, please. Far too many children are learning about abused embodiment. Child sexual abuse is an epidemic. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, 63,000 cases of child sexual abuse were substantiated in 2018. Every 9 minutes, Child Protective Services finds evidence to support another sexual abuse claim against the child. And of the 63,000 reports made in America each year, the perpetrator is the parent 80% of the time. This speaks to nothing of the cases that go unreported. The impact of this is far-reaching and filters out into all areas of the victim's life. Next slide. Child sexual abuse also rarely happens in a vacuum. It's usually not a single isolated event. It's accompanied by other adverse childhood experiences. And resilience is compromised in the abused body. In the 1990s, a researcher by the name of Vincent Folletti discovered a link between adverse childhood experiences and chronic illness in adulthood. He created a 10-point survey known as the ACE survey to explore this relationship. And he unearthed the reality that for every 1 point increase on the ACE, the risk of developing a chronic illness such as cancer, autoimmune disorder, or cardiovascular disorder later in life increased by 20%. So 1 point increase, 20% increased risk of chronic illness. People with a score of 6 or more had a 3,100 to 5,000% increase of injection drug abuse and a 46 times greater risk of suicide later in life. Victims of child sexual abuse alone are 4 times more likely to develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder as an adult. The impact of child sexual abuse extends also to spiritual health. It's strongly accompanied by feelings of shame, disgust, and self-loathing. And Jane Grovajon notes that the sexually abused body teaches one that they are not a person before God. She goes on to identify rape as a form of oppression and states that God is stolen from survivors brutally and quite thoroughly. She equates this to deicide, saying that she feels as if God has been killed within her. These words are affirmed by Susan Shooter, who explores how survivors of rape relate to God. And while there is hope in these studies, it's not achieved without first wading through an immensity of despair and damage. What awaits on the other side of this journey, however, is a deeply embodied, authentic, and personal awareness of God's presence. This journey is one of resilience, of healthily adapting in the face of trauma. And while the word healing may imply a complete cure which frees one from the ailment, resilience implies integration and wholeness. In the case of childhood sexual abuse, the traumas that one endures leave a lasting impact on the body, mind, and spirit. Resilience communicates that despite this horror, one can thrive. By embodying resilience and understanding that these statistical realities exist alongside deep theological truth, it is possible to integrate trauma and discover wholeness. And in the social scientific literature, resilience is best understood as a journey of growth. It's not a unique or innate gift. It's a learned behavior that can be taught and encouraged in a variety of ways. And one of those ways, a very powerful way, is through spirituality. So in observing individuals who identify as religious, it has been consistently found that a positive God image is linked to a higher demonstration of resiliency. A key component to building resilience is healthy community and a positive perspective. Emotional regulation, however, is altered among survivors of child abuse. So the structure of the brain physically changes as a result of the abuse. So these elements of resilience and positive perspective can be hard-won. Understanding that one is not alone and isolated as one navigates these dark and overwhelming feelings is tantamount to positive coping in the face of adversity. Shame is the opposite of resilience. And I had to let that truth soak in for a while, that shame is the opposite of resilience. If resilience is connected, shame tells the lie that you were isolated. So resilience connects, shame isolates. Shame is grounded in feelings of powerlessness, isolation, and imprisonment in a situation. It has been called the master emotion of everyday life that disconnects people and insidiously teaches that one is bad or not enough. Shame counters the story that humanity is unconditionally loved by God and that humanity is made in God's image. And instead, it tells a story of isolation, failure, and divisiveness. If healthy community, courage, and awareness are integral to resilience and shame debilitates and functions as its opposite, then how can survivors hope to thrive in the face of this seemingly crippling adversity? Mary, the young Virgin Mother of Christ, provides insight into these particular challenges. So to explore this understanding of Mary, I will be looking at the canonical Gospels of Luke and Matthew and the apocryphal Infancy Gospel of James. With Matthew and Luke being written around 80 and the Infancy Gospel of James approximately 60 years later, we can see that the early church showed concern for the person of Mary. The Infancy Gospel of James demonstrates that as early as 140 CE, early Christians were trying to harmonize these infancy narratives that are found in Matthew and Luke. And while Luke provides a voice of praise and community in its discussion of Mary, Matthew provides an account of the struggles endured. The Infancy Gospel of James integrates the two and provides a voice and body for Mary that supplements the canonical Gospels. So the three together raise questions about Mary that are not new to the 21st century. Rather, they demonstrate the very practical and spiritual questions that humanity has been concerned with for millennia. So we'll start by looking at Luke. So Luke's account of the infancy narrative highlights the blessing of Mary, her relationship with Elizabeth, and John the Baptist's birth origins. So throughout the first two chapters, the text pretty steadily alternates between Elizabeth and Mary. So first, the birth of John the Baptist is foretold, followed closely by the foretelling of the birth of Jesus. And when Mary receives the news from the angel Gabriel, she's confused at first. She says, "But how can this be? I'm a virgin." And the angel informs her that she'll conceive by the Holy Spirit and that her older cousin Elizabeth is also with child. Mary's response is, "Here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." Immediately following this, Mary sets out to visit Elizabeth with haste, and she stays with her for 3 months. Elizabeth notes that as soon as Mary greeted her, John the Baptist leaped in her womb. In this moment, Elizabeth is learning about God through her body. So as the child leaps in her womb, the significance of Mary's pregnancy is affirmed, it's made known. She says, "Blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord." So the very movement of the baby within her body, she kind of gets this connective wisdom from God that this is a big moment. Mary's Magnificat follows this, and she then stays with Elizabeth for 3 months. And while Mary cared for her cousin, who's described as getting on in years, the parallel experience of the two women can't be ignored. So both of these women have found themselves connecting with the women of the Jewish tradition as they miraculously conceived. Both of these women are pregnant with children that are intimately connected to God. Both women must grow to understand the blessing that is growing inside of them. And both women will be taught and pointed to salvation by the fruit of their bodies. You can't help but wonder how this revelation impacted their understanding of self. Elizabeth remains in seclusion for 5 months and notes that through this pregnancy, her disgrace has been taken away. She's echoing the Old Testament, but what a shift, right? that she's pregnant, and then her disgrace is taken away. So she moves from this disgraced, barren woman to a woman carrying a son with the, quote, spirit and power of Elijah, who will prepare people for the Lord. No consideration is given in Luke's gospel to the social tension that must have surrounded Mary, the unmarried virgin who's found to be with child. In fact, Joseph isn't introduced until chapter 2 when Jesus is about to be born. But you can imagine that Mary likely had some very ordinary, well-laid plans, right, for her life that have now been disrupted as she consents to carry this child. Pregnancy alone demands that one mature, and I know we've got some mothers in the room, right? It really puts you in touch with your body. So to be present with the Messiah would be overwhelming, because to be pregnant anyway is kind of overwhelming. But when you add that layer on top of it, it's really impactful. Beyond this, the pregnant body intrudes into one's line of sight, and it demands constant awareness. You can't not see the pregnant body. It's a powerful and persistent call to connect, to create, to nurture life. The pregnant body is a responsive body that's ripe with relationship. And in the case of Mary, her body is ripe in relationship with God. The time that she spends with Elizabeth during their pregnancies may not have only served as a support visit, it may have also been connective and community building. So as both women consented to this life-changing event of miraculous conception, they're also not alone in their processing. Praise of God shines through in the Gospel of Luke as Mary notes that surely from now on all generations will call me blessed. She later finds community support in the form of shepherds when they travel to tell her that her child is the Messiah, and she treasures these words and ponders them in her heart. These unexpected and unlikely visitors share news that further affirm the blessing that she's been nurturing for months. And later, at the temple, when Jesus is taken to be circumcised, she receives more affirmation from Anna and Simeon. Simeon has waited his entire life to meet this child, and he proclaims that his eyes have seen God's salvation. While Anna praises God and tells people of Jerusalem about the child, Simeon tells Mary, quote, "This child is destined for the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be opposed, so that the inner thoughts of many will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too." Mary thus finds further community and connection at the temple. She's lived into the Word of God through pregnancy and birth, and while the words of affirmation she received so far have been comforting, Simeon's words hold an ominous but accurate tone. So her connection with other people in the Gospel of Luke plays a significant role in her perspective and identity as she grows through the infancy narratives. From an ordinary young virgin to the extraordinary mother of Christ, her initial confusion during the Annunciation is met with affirmation each time she encounters another person. She's able to walk through a part of her journey with her cousin Elizabeth, who understands her experience better than anyone else possibly could. Time and again, she's reminded that the salvation of the world will be born from her body. The caveat, however, comes in Simeon's warning of her own pierced heart. This salvation will not be without sorrow. The very language used to describe this sorrow, that of a piercing sword, invites us to reflect upon the presence of pain within the body. As Mary pondered the words from the shepherd in her heart, did she feel the piercing of Simeon's words in her heart as well? Did her stomach knot or her shoulders tighten as she absorbed the weight of this? Community is an integral part of building resilience for adult survivors of child sexual abuse. And the insidious nature of sexual trauma teaches that one's alone, disgusting, rejected from society as a result of the horrors done to them. Hope, however, is found by countering this narrative. Survivors are not alone, and other people do know what they've experienced. The healing and hope that survivors can bring to the world is evident in the eyes of other people, just as the shepherds were made aware of the gift of Christ. This journey of redemption, however, will not be easy. Just as Simeon warns Mary that her heart will be pierced, so too must the survivor realistically acknowledge that building resilience does not occur without pain. The Gospel of Matthew presents an infancy narrative that's tense with this idea of displacement. It's in this text that Jesus, the future liberator, is under the threat of Herod. The Holy Family must flee to Egypt in order to protect the life of their child. The book of Matthew begins with a genealogy of Jesus, citing notable women in the list: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, Mary, each women with difficult and unconventional stories. Mary's voice is pretty absent in the infancy narratives in Matthew. The author opts instead to present revelatory information through Joseph via angelic visitors and dreams. In chapter 1, Joseph discovers that Mary is with child, and at first he plans to dismiss her quietly so as to avoid public disgrace. He logically assumes, as any of us would, that she's pregnant because she was with another person. An angel, however, appears to him in a dream and tells him that she's conceived from the Holy Spirit. And when Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son. We then fast forward a little, and Herod receives word that Jesus has been born in Bethlehem. He seeks to destroy him. After a visit from wise men, Joseph is told in a dream to take Mary and the child and flee to Egypt for safety. They set out in the middle of the night as Herod kills all children under the age of 2, and they do not return to Israel until Herod has died. It does not take a very dramatic stretch of the imagination to consider how Mary must have felt in these moments. Where in Luke, her calling as the mother of Christ is reaffirmed at every turn, in Matthew, she must face these seemingly insurmountable challenges. Matthew draws awareness to the fact that Mary's pregnancy does pose social problems, as Joseph nearly dismisses her. What must it have been like for Mary to tell Joseph of this pregnancy, knowing what his reaction could be? What must it have been like to be pregnant and unmarried in a society that would have seen this as a significant act of dishonor and shame? In Matthew's gospel, Mary must deal with uncertainty and fear from the moment of conception. How did she feel about her own body in the midst of this threat of rejection? Did she readily embrace her growing womb, or did she try to hide it for fear of humiliation and shame? Did she fully understand the changes happening to her body in the experience of pregnancy? These are all questions that the Infancy Gospel of James will later address. Beyond the scandal of a seemingly illegitimate pregnancy, Mary also has to flee in the middle of the night to protect her newly born child. But in order to protect her child, she must protect her body, because his protection is found in her arms and at her breast. She must run for her child's life in the middle of the night to escape the threat of a power that should have been the force of order and protection in the world. This uncontrolled and jealous power of Herod came seemingly out of nowhere when least expected. How could Mary stay focused on the feelings of blessing and praise so adamantly described in Luke's gospel while being forced across the desert in the middle of the night? Was her body weakened from birth and a sleepless infant as she made this trek? Were her feet worn and tired as she snuck stealthily through the night? Did fear tighten her throat and drive her forward, or was she comforted by the call placed upon her life? Sexual abuse terrorizes and threatens to destroy all that is safe and good about the child's world. Healthy attachment and trust is fragmented when the child is abused by the very figures in which they seek security. Like the infant Jesus, sexually abused children are at the mercy of the powers that surround them. Just as leaders like Herod should be a source of order and protection in the world, so too should the adults that care for children. Most sexual abusers, however, are acquaintances or family members, and far too often society denies or covers up these horrendous acts of violence. This uncontrolled and unchecked power often occurs under the cloak of secrecy or in the middle of the night when children are sleeping. Just as the Holy Family had to leave in the middle of the night in search of safety and protection, so too do sexually abused children seek safety in the midst of oppressive darkness. With weakened bodies and souls, fearful and weary from the journey of survival, safety is sought in the darkness. The child, unexpectedly threatened, is entrusted to Mary's care. Adult survivors hold their own inner child with the same difficulty. In the dark desert, how can one find the way to safety? How does one honor and protect the threatened child within? Where is God now after the Magnificat has been sung? And how does one remember the blessing when disaster could strike at literally any moment? How does one allow faith to guide their steps rather than fear and self-doubt? The vulnerable Christ child and the faithful Mary traversing the darkness to find security and fulfill God's call can be a model through which to explore these difficult questions of resilience. Mary and Jesus do not succumb to Herod's evil or fall prey in the desert, nor is their struggle denied. Rather, they journey on to bring redemption and love to the world, the likes of which have never been seen before. The Infancy Gospel of Infancy Gospel of James was written around 140 to 160 CE, around 60 to 80 years after the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. It's one of the more popular apocryphal texts. It's been well circulated in a variety of languages. The work is pseudepigraphical in nature. It's written by a single author who claims to be James, a relative of the Lord. The text clearly demonstrates a thoughtful awareness of both Matthew and Luke and seeks to coalesce these infancy narratives. Capturing the magnificence of Luke, the trauma of Matthew, and addressing unanswered practical questions, this text in particular emphasizes Mary's voice and body. And while a complete account of this Infancy Gospel of James would be too exhaustive to discuss here, there are several key elements that are worth noting. Mary struggles with issues of shame and confusion heavily throughout the duration of her pregnancy in this text. Despite these strong elements, however, her story holds a resurrection-like quality which echoes the canonical Gospels. In this text, Mary grows up in the temple, and once she begins menstruating, she's betrothed to Joseph. Joseph is presented as a caretaker, and he's entrusted with Mary's care. So more so than a husband or a lover, he's really kind of presented as, here is this virgin, take care of her. Mary is visited by an angel of the Lord, and she's told that she will conceive from the word of the Lord. But when she hears this, Mary is distraught. She's confused. She says, if I conceive from the Lord God who lives, will I also conceive as all other women conceive? And the angel of the Lord clarifies for her. It says the power of God will come over her, and her son will save people from their sins. So it echoes the Gospel of Luke, and Mary says, she consents and says, let it happen to me according to your will. Later, she expresses doubt as she echoes the Magnificat. She says, who am I, Lord, that all generations of the earth will bless me? So who could I possibly be that this is actually going to happen? She spends 3 months with Elizabeth, as she does in the canonical Gospels, and as her belly grows, she tries to hide her pregnancy from her community. So she tries to hide herself away because she knows that this is kind of an edgy thing. Who's going to believe this? So later, when she tells Joseph of her pregnancy, he immediately fears that she's been defiled or raped. He says, who did this evil in my house? Who stole the virgin from me and defiled her? Like, we're good, right? But then he turns to her and says, how have you humiliated yourself? So he turns to her and he shames her, telling her she's humiliated herself, and she tearfully tries to explain to Joseph that she did nothing wrong, that she's not sure what's really going on with her body, and she's very confused. Joseph is afraid, but he receives guidance from an angel in a dream and vows to protect the child. And when the pregnancy is discovered by a scribe, that scribe runs to the temple and tells the priest. And the scribe says, hey, Joseph defiled this virgin. He was supposed to take her and protect her. And the priest says, are you sure? And he says, look, she's with child. And so the priest and the scribe have assumed that Joseph is the one that has defiled her. But when they see Mary, the first thing they say is, Mary, you've humiliated yourself. And she's confused and tearful and further shamed, this time at the hands of a religious institution. The Infancy Gospel of James echoes the traumatic story that's found in Matthew as Herod seeks to kill Jesus. When Mary discovers that Herod is killing young children, she's terrified and she hides among the cattle with her baby. The story notably kind of omits the flight to Egypt, however, instead discussing Herod's attempt to kill John the Baptist as well as Jesus. And while Zachariah is killed, John the Baptist and Elizabeth remain safe. The text does not end with a neat return to Israel and continuation of Jesus' life, as does Matthew. Mary's shame and confusion is palpable in this text. It is clear that she has anxiety and confusion in regards to what's happening to her body. Just as survivors are often overwhelmed with confusion and fear, so too is Mary. The sensations and responses within the body are intensely felt and really scream for attention. Mary, a young virgin, maybe 14 years old, must navigate these dramatic changes to her body, which prove to be overwhelming even for women who have planned their pregnancies. And these confusing and dramatic changes are accompanied by the realization that she could be rejected, dishonored, and dismissed by her society at literally any moment. To name this pregnancy is to risk isolation and humiliation. The risk is affirmed by both her protector and her religious institution when they first learn of it. This text draws attention to the body of Mary, really placing her within her body as she seeks to kind of figure out what's going on. But it also maintains how pious she is. So while maintaining her piety and struggle, this text grounds Mary in both voice and body. It's here that she can most deeply connect with adult survivors of sexual trauma. Shame and confusion in regards to the body are two of the most daunting elements to integrate when building resiliency in the aftermath of childhood trauma. Children often feel that the horrors they endure are their fault. Individuals who should provide order and protection instead create chaos and pain. And this abuse leaves survivors feeling dirty, disgusting, broken, and mutated at a deep level. They're often confused in the midst of trauma, as well as years later when their bodies respond in ways that they just don't consciously understand. This shame is exacerbated by society when they're not believed or shamed or blamed for the horrors that they've endured. Mary embodies a story that is both miraculous and relatable, pious and scandalous, courageous and centered. Her story dances in this surreal equilibrium where resilience and the overwhelming power of God is made known. Operating as an image of resilience for adult survivors of child sexual trauma, the dichotomous nature of this comparison is made evident in her embodiment of community displacement, shame, and confusion. Within this text, Mary herself is miraculously conceived as her barren mother Anna prays for a child. Anna later says that her daughter's birth removed my horrible disgrace from me. Thus, Mary's very presence removes the stain of shame. And although she's certainly confronted with her fair share of humiliation and fear throughout her journey, it's worth noting that despite this, her existence is still one which eradicates shame. What greater hope can exist for a survivor? Both Mary's shame and the shame of survivors discussed here is sexual in nature. Despite the common understanding of Mary as a perpetual virgin, the threat to her identity which existed was sexual insofar as it relates to the broader social understanding of her pregnancy. She was not married and somehow conceived, therefore she must have done something wrong. To know that Mary has endured the weight of sexual shame and her presence still eradicates disgrace is one of the ultimate comfort and understanding. Pregnancy and abuse both demand that one mature quickly. Mary embodies this maturation in all three texts. As a willing servant of God in Luke, she consents to mothering the Christ child and embarks upon a courageous journey. This courageous willingness leads her through unforeseen challenges that seem insurmountable. Rapidly changing from a young virgin to a fully embodied mother of Christ, Mary speaks her innocence, praises God, and does what is necessary despite her fear to protect her child and save her body. So too must survivors embody this mature courage as they consent to build resilience and embark on a journey which will lead to redemption for both self and others. The challenges unexpectedly thrust upon the survivor along the way may seem insurmountable, but it requires that one do what is necessary to protect the inner child within that has been threatened by this jealous power. While tradition and truth attest the reality that humanity is made in God's image, Mary goes one step further in that she quite literally embodies the divine. She is arguably the mother of embodied theology. The body that is born from her heals the entire world. But for survivors who may struggle with a masculine image of God or even Christ due to severe abuse, Mary is a feminine image who understands their plight. It is through her body that Christ enters the world. It is when she honors and accepts her body that redemption is brought forth. The Infancy Gospel of James does not depict a typical birth when Jesus enters the world. Rather, the area is filled with light, and then the baby Jesus appears. In an event not unlike the resurrection, Mary's body is then probed to verify that she is indeed a virgin. As Thomas was invited to place his hands inside of Jesus in the Gospel of John, Salome, the mother of James and John, places her fingers inside of Mary to verify this miracle. The woman who deeply understands the power of community and praise, the fear of displacement and threat, the shame of confusion of the body, is also the woman whose very body radiates resurrection. Despite what she has endured, she's found pure. For survivors of child sexual trauma, there can be no greater hope than that of newness and purity despite the difficult journey. Just as Mary's body was touched and found pure, the abused body, though touched, is deemed pure by God. So to conclude, the sexually abused body so often holds the lie that one's disgusting, shameful, and alone. It holds mistrust as the agony within the structure of the body seemingly lashes out in every direction. Its effects are pervasive. In order to cultivate resilience, in order to adapt well in the face of trauma, one must fully enter the body and feel the experiences which have created lies of shame and division. Just as Mary was displaced as she sought to protect herself and her baby, just as Mary walked through shame and confusion, so too must survivors be momentarily displaced as they experience and seek safety. Resilience, however, pushes one towards wholeness and thus salvation. It's a journey of hope and discovery. One must not forget the Magnificat. Blessing, salvation, and redemption grew within Mary just as it grows within survivors. Despite enduring fear and shame and social stigma, Mary is probed and found to be pure. She is able to somehow endure shame, the very opposite of resilience, and still embody Christ. So too can survivors embody the truth of Christ's love. Resilience is a learned behavior that can be fostered by the church. Through critical reflection on Scripture, familiar stories can take on new meaning. Just as Marie, in the opening narrative of this research, silently dissociated and left her body in the midst of abuse, the Blessed Virgin Mother pondered the changes to her own body. Both would be forever altered. Both would continually learn to listen to the language of their bodies. Both would become aware of the intimate relationship with God held within their flesh. While one shows the height of all goodness, the other shows the depth of corruption. One is a lived experience of forgotten people in our pews, and the other decorates the windows of our sanctuaries. Though these two feel millennia apart, for the church to become a community of resilience, it is time to revisit and reflect critically upon Scripture. This reflection enables survivors to begin a journey towards resilience and discover and embody their truth. Just as the ancient author of the Infancy Gospel of James sought to fill in the blanks of a dynamic narrative, so too must the church provide answers and reflection for the sake of survivors. The church must help survivors discover the truth within the body, that despite shame, confusion, fear, and trauma, we all carry the love of Christ within. The church must help survivors embody resilience. Thank you.
It wasn't easy for me to take it, and it's been awesome. I want to move straight ahead.
someone is still a virgin after giving birth.
Yeah.
And then you conclude by saying shame is something that Mary felt, but she was concluded to still give a miraculous virgin after giving birth. But yet, people who are sexually abused, they don't get that. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I actually think that's a huge hallmark, a huge barrier to healing with sexual abuse, is the fact that if your virginity is taken when you're 9 years old, then when you willingly give your virginity away when you're 20, have you really given your virginity away if it was stolen from you? In the same way that James Robert says that God is stolen from you. And I think that so often this concept of virginity is a social construct, and part of that is being able to socially and spiritually kind of understand the self as still pure and not defiled, even though one has encountered abuse. And at the end of the kind of middle towards the end of the Infancy Gospel, when Salome biologically tries to verify that Mary is still a virgin, in that gospel, Jesus appears in a white light. There's no actual birth. He just kind of pops up, sort of like he does in the resurrection. So that's kind of, I think, to try to apply logic to what the text is saying, that's how it gets there. But to answer the broader, kind of more existential question, I think that that's a barrier to healing, is that we need to help survivors realize that just because something was stolen from them doesn't mean that they can't, that they are impure or disgraced or shamed.
Thank you.
Questions, contributions, suggestions, inputs? Mary's embodied resilience.
You read, he was Maria Harris, about flesh, embodied flesh.
We did read some Maria Harris this semester, but
You mean in Flesh and Freedom?
Yeah.
in Flesh and Freedom, yeah. Sean Copeland, there you go.
Yes, correct.
Yes.
So I tried using that for mine, but she was dealing completely with flesh, which I think is ignoring a large part of the body. But I understand what she's talking about Christ's flesh, being his humanity, and then a woman's flesh being her humanity. So have you explored any of that aspect of embodied theology? Or?
Yeah, I had just, I'm working my way through a book now called, the subtitle of it is Poetics of the Flesh, that focuses specifically on that idea of like enfleshing the body. I'm with you though, I think that there's a deeper element that while we can't ignore the flesh of the body, and that's definitely a spot I'm going to go to first, that I always try to bring that into dialogue with neuroscience, because I'm super interested in neuroscience, and in particular how the brain and body are related in trauma. And what we're learning is that memory doesn't just live within the brain, it lives within the very cells of your body. And so to kind of deepen that understanding has been really helpful for me when trying to think about, well, where is God in the body?
I have a question about Mary with the ACE score. Earlier you talked about the ACE score.
Mm-hmm.
Where would she be at on that if we were looking at her as a trauma victim?
Oh gosh, I've got to count it up. Hold on. Let's go parents. No, she's probably a solid 4. So just without the test in front of me, she's got some trauma, right? And I think too, some of that is going to depend. I need to bring that back into dialogue with neuroscience. Their culture is very different, right? I'm going to marry you off at 14 versus so the development of the brain, the impact of trauma based on where the brain is at in development has a significant difference in how you understand the body. But she's up there. Yeah.
I appreciated your emphasis on resilience over healing as a mental health survivor myself, in my situation rather. So thoughts along the lines of continued resilience for victims of sexual abuse. And how would you look at that with the lens of Mary, continued resilience? You know, you mentioned the cross that pierced her soul. And every time I think of Mary, I think of her as the one who went to the cross, the one of the few. But I would like to know, particularly along the lines of continued resilience, what does that look like?
Daily resurrection. That's my short answer. I think that continued resilience requires daily resurrection. That part of healing from trauma is acknowledging that you don't know everything that happened to you, especially if it happened to you as a child. And that healing occurs in a continual process of discovery. And so for Mary, I wonder if the experiences she had in the infancy narratives in some ways helped her build some resiliency to prep for the later crucifixion. I'm not saying that she could ever be prepared for that, of course, but that the lessons she learned in the midst of that, of community, of you know, the knowledge of what her son was going to do in the world, of you know, the aftermath, you know, the resurrection. If all of those things may have played into her continued building of resiliency. Does that answer your question?